The first step when you want to get sponsorship from your employer is to figure out how they handle decisions like this. And the way you do that is, reading the rules and regulations probably help, but you want to find cases where they've dealt with similar requests before. Once you figure out the right person to talk to, the important thing when you're trying to make your case is to not talk about yourself. The standard advice in managing up is to talk about the interests of the person you're talking to or the organization. In other words, why would it help the company if I went to the WEMBA program? Talking about why it's meaningful to you, talking about what you'll get out of it personally are not things that they want to hear about. It really should be about how is this going to help the employer. Trying to demonstrate to the employer why it is useful for the employer for you to go to this program is a little tricky because you haven't done it yet, of course. I think one of the things that you might do is look at other people in the organization who have MBA degrees and the kind of work that they've been able to do. But I think what I might try to do is to look a little bit through the MBA curriculum and see if you can identify problems that are discussed that are also ones that your company is facing right now. And I would talk about those to the person you're pitching your case to. Look, the Wharton program is dealing with issues like this one, and so are we. That's why it's helpful if I go to the program. For example, you might look to see problems that you know your company has had, particularly if they were ones that were public and big ones, and then look to the Wharton program and see if there were places in the program where that problem was addressed or could have been addressed. And you could say, for example, that problem we had with billing where we couldn't get our billing done on time, we couldn't get it out appropriately, and that's something in the operations research class at Wharton that they address to give them a sense that the program's pretty concrete and will be able to address problems that affect the company. An interesting question is always about demographics and negotiations and whether it matters a lot. You should negotiate differently depending on the culture or your gender. I think the gender differences, frankly, are pretty overplayed and they change a lot country by country too. So I think the country differences matter a lot, and I think the big issues there are about the importance of relationship, the willingness to engage in conflict. You don't want to damage your work relationship while you're trying to negotiate this agreement. That's most likely to occur if you're from one culture and your employer is from another, or the company you're working for is from another. So I guess I would pay close attention to that, and I would err on the side of protecting the relationship and err on the side of not pushing too hard or trying to confront your boss on this issue. I think it's important not to downplay the significance of the negotiations with your family about taking on this program. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time. And I think the first thing you want to do is be transparent about it. You don't want to downplay the time commitments, but I do think you can tell them it's temporary, and you might start to think through with them how you might accommodate this, whether there's help with the family you can get from other relatives or whether there's other accommodations you can make in order to smooth out the workload, because your partner's going to be carrying much more of it during this period. So think about it from their perspective. This is a big deal. It's maybe just as big a deal for them as it is for you. And don't minimize the consequences for them, because they're going to be pretty big and they've probably already thought about them. Suppose you get turned down, suppose you ask and the employer says no, what do you do next? I think the important thing is to figure out why they said no. And sometimes that requires a little investigation. They may say, give you a reason, but you may suspect it's not the real reason. And then the question is going to be, can you do anything about that? I think the issue about going immediately back is a little tricky, unless the reason you got turned down is something you can easily address, like something about the schedule or something that was just factually wrong that the employer thought. If it turns out it's not something simple like that, I think you have to wait a while before you go back. Now, an interesting question is always whether you should go to somebody else. That's very tricky. Your boss turns you down, but there's somebody in corporate whose ear you might have and be able to ask them. There's a big risk you're going to damage the relationship with your boss if you do that. On the other hand, if it's a big company and you're likely to move inside the company anyway, and this is a lot of money we're talking about, maybe it's worth taking that risk.